Let's start by taking a look at the Power BI Desktop Interface. At the top is a ribbon, and I love that because I've certainly grown familiar with it over the years using it with Office. So a lot of functionality is exposed very conveniently through the ribbon, and we're going to explore and dig into each of these tabs. For now, just know that it's there. On the left, you have 3 tabs. They're not going to look very interesting right now. 3 tabs or 3 views. The first is a report view, the next one is a data view, and the last one is a relationship view. And on here are visualization and fields. Again, we're going to bring in some data, and as we go through it, you will see all of these elements in action again. So really, that is the first step you do in Power BI Desktop, which is you get data. Now, if you look here, if you click Get Data, it lists some of the common sources, but if you click More, you got access to every little thing, and the Power BI team is constantly adding connectors to new data sources. Often, even if a connector is not available, you can sometimes connect to it using a generic driver, like an ODBC driver perhaps. For our scenario, we're going to start off by connecting to an Access database. And what I've done is I have saved my files in C:/temp. So this is the database that I'm first going to connect to. And in our scenario, this is representing some system data source, right? So typically in any organization, a business user would connect to some system data source. It could be a data warehouse, SQL, SAP, something like that. In our case, we're just going to have an Access database, which stands in for that. So I'm going to hit connect. And if I go to C:/temp, that's my AdventureWorks database. I'm just going to click open. And for a lot of these connectors, the first steps are going to be different, how it connects to, how it authenticates to it. But from that point on, often the navigation experience is the same. So a lot of data sources you connect to, it'll just show you the list of entities that it found. In this case, it's showing me the list of tables that it found inside that Access database. Now I can click on each one and it generates a quick preview. In case there are lots and lots of tables in the system database perhaps that you're connecting with, then you can use the preview to make sure you're pulling in the right data table. In our case, I'm just going to select each one of these. And for now, you notice down at the bottom there are 3 buttons, Load, Edit, and Cancel. For now, we're just going to click Load, and that's going to load it in the database. So now it's actually going to the data source and copying that data set into my Power BI desktop file. So let's go ahead and save this file first. So C:/temp. All right, and we'll say Power BI. Now what I wanted to do was to show you what that file looks like. So let's go to details, and if you can zoom in here. So notice this was my Access database. It's about 20 megabytes in size, and this is my Power BI model. Now it's just about less than 4 megabytes in size. Now this is interesting because we pulled in every single table from that Access database, and you can see that our Power BI model is noticeably smaller. So that's one advantage of having a data model, that the underlying technology. So what it's doing is it's one of the techniques it's using for compression is called columnar compression. So instead of storing data row by row, it's storing it column by column, and that gives you a very good compression ratio. It also has other optimization techniques which it uses to compress data. So we pulled in this data set, and that data set is copied over and saved in this file. Now, if we were to connect to 5 different data sources, each one of those will be pulled in our file, and a copy would be kept within the file. And the only time it'll go back to that source would be when I hit refresh here, or we'll talk about how you can set up automatic refresh using the Power BI.com service or other capabilities, right? So when the refresh is invoked, either manually or through an automated process, that's when the model connects back to the source and gets the data. So all the tables have been pulled in here, and now this looks a little more interesting. Now we have fields on the side, we see these tables over here, and if I go to the data tab, this looks alive. Again, we have the tables, and I can tab through different tables, look at customer, look at product, see what's going on, just sample the data I have pulled in, look at the relationship view, and it does create some relationships automatically. We'll talk a lot more about relationships and tables later, but for now, let's just focus on getting data. So we're going to go ahead and pull in data from another data source, and this one is kind of representing manual or offline data. And I see this scenario all the time, that business users have to combine some systemic data with some other data source. It's either manual or their own department data set, which is not available in the system sources. Could be a third party, could be something they're pulling from the web. So we're going to go to get data again and click more. And this one is actually an Excel file, so we're going to click connect, and SQL and temp, that's my budget file, that's one I have downloaded, and I'm going to click open. Again, this represents a manual data source, and there's only one table. I can click on it to see a preview. I do want this table, but this time I'm not going to click load, because clearly this is a little messed up. I don't want this column 1, column 2. That's not how I want to load this data, amongst other changes. So this time I'm going to click edit, right? Now, when you click edit, you would notice on the left that this is not the first query. The tables that we loaded earlier are also represented here, but they was just the default. I mean, they don't have much going on here. It just simply grabs the table from the database. But for budget, it kind of grabs the table from the database, but we know we need a lot more transformation. By the way, this is a new window, so this is a query editor. Notice how it's opened as a separate window from the Power BI Desktop, but you can consider it a component of Power BI Desktop. So let's go through the query editor interface quickly. Again, the ribbon up top, very, very easy to use. A lot of stuff, 95% of what I use is just by clicking buttons up on the ribbon. Over on the left, you have the queries pane. A lot of times you end up with quite a few queries in your data model, and this helps you kind of navigate, go across, and just quickly edit the query that you need to. So that's a query pane. I'm just going to collapse it for now because we're going to focus on the budget query. Over here, this is showing you how the data set is going to be loaded. Now, this does not pull in the complete data set. In our case, it just happens to be a very small data set, so you're actually seeing everything. But imagine you were connecting to a table which had 1 million rows. By no means it's going to pull in 1 million rows and show them to you here. It shows you just a preview, just the top, a few hundred rows, I think, that it shows you here. So it shows you a preview of the data set and lets you work with that. Over on the right side are some of the most interesting elements. So sure, there's the query name. I can change that if I wanted to. There's also an all properties button. I can click that and I can perhaps specify more description. This is a great thing for documentation for yourself or somebody else who might step in your place. You notice there are some other options here. We're going to come back and talk about these options later. For now, description is interesting, but really my favorite part is this applied steps. Oh boy, this is magical. Now, when you connect to an Excel sheet like this, what it does is it scans the columns and tries to make its best guess about the data type. Now, notice in our data set, and let me show you the. All right, so this is the file that we're trying to load. And this is what I call a human-friendly file. Right? It's got headers up there. It's got color coding. It's got subtotals, grand totals here, and the numbers are spread across on the columns. And this is fine. This is probably, well, at least in this scenario, we're pretending that this is actually manually maintained by a group, right? So they go through maybe a review cycle and they discuss the number, what it needs to be, and they come back and type it in, right? So it's maintained manually. So that's the file we're connecting to. And go back to Power BI Desktop. So we're trying to pull it in here, but clearly it needs some cleanup. So in this scenario, when you don't have the data starting up top, then often this automatic step that's added, change type, doesn't really help. So in most scenarios, what I do is just hit an X to delete that step, right? So this is very easy to work with. A lot of these have this gear icon, which you can use to, let's say, change that steps. In this case, I can point to a different location. Imagine if a file source moved, now it's found in this folder rather than that folder. You can quickly fix that. Or you can also just hit the X and delete that step. So change type, let's get rid of that. We'll worry about that later. And let's get started working on this data set. The first thing we're going to do is remove these rows up top, these 3 rows. And they're not needed. So I'm just going to click remove rows, remove top rows. And I'm going to say 3, remove 3 rows, hit OK. And notice what happened here. First of all, this step got recorded, remove top rows, and of course that's reflected here as well. 3 rows are gone. And the cool part is you can step back and forth through these steps. So you can go back and like, oh, this is how the data came in, and click, this is my next step. There's a textual description which tells me what happened here, remove top rows, and boom, I can see in the data set that that's gone. Let's keep going, and as I'm going along, I want you to keep your eyes glued on this applied step. This is really, really cool. All right, great. So now what I want to do, I don't want this column 1, 2, 3 headers in there. Really, row 1, the first row, should be used as headers. Guess what? There's a button for that. Right here, use first row as headers. I'm going to click, and again, it's going to transform it here and record that step over here. So use first row as headers. Boom, that's done. Again, you can replay it. Go back, click. This is what the changes happen. Let's remove the subtotals here. So I'm just going to click on the arrow, and this exposes a lot of options. For now, we're just going to say text filters does not contain total. Now, mind you that Power Query in general is case sensitive. So if I type in lowercase total, let's try that. Notice the subtotal rows and grand total. That doesn't do anything. I mean, it says filtered rows, but nothing happened here. So I'm going to delete that step and try it again. Text filters does not contain. And this time I'm going to use a right case total. And now those are gone. This is probably the first thing that caught me off guard, the case sensitivity. But once you're aware, I don't think you're going to get in trouble. And of course, there are lots of functions and methods to get around it. If you don't want you want a case insensitive matching, you can do that. You can convert things all to uppercase or lowercase and then do the matching or things like that. So we'll make sure we'll cover that at a later point. So for now, you got filtered rows done, subtotals are gone. If we scroll all the way to the right, there's a grand total column, which we do not want because, again, we have the monthly totals. No need for the grand total. So we're going to right click on it and just say remove. And by the way, the button is up here as well, remove column. So again, grand total is gone and it's recorded in here. Perfect. Now the next step is by far my favorite. So here, if you look at the shape of this data, it's spread across these columns. And this is a human-friendly shape, but not a machine-friendly, because it's hard to instruct the model later on to say, hey, give me a sum of the budget. You have to say, oh yeah, sum this column and this column and this column, and keep going. That's very hard to do. What we would prefer is that instead of these months being on columns, that they were on rows instead. Now, this operation is called Unpivot. I didn't really care or understood why it's called that, but that's how I knew it. And I knew it in my Excel days, and I felt so proud of myself that I knew this trick of how to unpivot data quickly. And the trick was that I would load the data, typically in Excel, into a SQL table, into a SQL server, and then I'll crack open my SQL book, look up the unpivot command, because I would always forget the syntax, type it in, get the results, and save them back to an Excel file. So it took me a while to do it, but I thought, man, how neat that I can do it. And then I discovered Power Query, and the first time I encountered this, and I realized that all I have to do is just click this button. Click Unpivot column, boom, done, right? So the data, again, you can play it back. Data was spread across in columns, January through December, unpivot, and now it's organized in rows. So now when I send it back to the data model, and we're going to look at measures later on, to sum the budget, I just have to sum this column. Let's clean up a few things here. So for this one, we can just double click, or you can right click and say rename, which I can never find. And I'll say this is the month. And I'll just double click and say this is the budget amount. Now you notice that there are these icons next to each of these columns. And this one, ABC123, is really alphanumeric, so it can be anything. This one, it thinks it's a text value. And this one, it thinks is alphanumeric as well. So clearly, that's not quite right. And the easiest way to change is to actually click that icon. You can click that icon and choose what you want it to be. So this one, I want it to be a date, because later we're going to connect to the calendar table. You're going to learn all about that. Right, so this is a date now. Notice the icon changed, and again, the change type step was recorded. Now notice something interesting here. I'm going to change this value. So I'm going to say budget amount, and actually I'll point out something else to you. So you may not see this when the first time you start working with Power BI Desktop. In the query editor, you may have noticed that I pointed out the ribbon, I pointed out the panel over here, the data pane itself, but I didn't mention another element which you see here, which is called the formula bar. Now this is really interesting. And you may not see it by default because this needs to be turned on. So if you go to the View tab, you can toggle it off or on. By default, it's off, but I think it's really, really cool. And even if you don't care about it for now, you probably don't. Beginners, you should still turn it on, because it just gets you in the habit of looking at it, getting slightly familiar with it, because eventually you're going to start stepping into it and mucking with it. And it's not as hard as it seems. Really, a lot of it, for one, makes sense. I mean, if you read it, it kind of makes sense, right? So change type, it's saying table.transform column types. Okay, makes sense. It's trying to change the column type, transform column types. Rename columns, it actually is referring to the previous step here, rename columns. Okay, go there. And then change the month to type date, right? So it makes sense. All right, so let's do another step here. And we're going to go to budget amount and change that to fixed decimal number or currency. Now notice what happens here. We do not get an extra step. Instead, it combined it in the same step. And it kind of makes sense. So it's efficient that way. It's doing the right thing. It said, okay, if you go ahead and change types of 5 of your 20 columns, I'm not going to add 5 change type steps. I'm just going to keep 1. And it's going to say change month to type date, change budget amount to currency, and so on and so forth, right? So it's pretty cool. It does the smart thing. All right, I think we're done with the transformations. And now it's time to send our data back. All right, my bad. I actually missed one step. The product key needs to be numeric as well. And we'll talk about relationships later on, but really you can examine it right here as well. A budget table is eventually going to connect to the product table. And if I go to the product table and look at the product key, this one is numeric. I can see the data type right here using that icon. So I'm going to make sure that this one is numeric as well. Otherwise, my relationship would not work. So let's make it a whole number, and that's it. And now we're ready to go. So I'm going to click home. You can also click just close, and it'll prompt you to apply. But we're going to come back to the home tab in the ribbon and click close and apply. All right, so we go back, and again, it goes out, connects to that data source, however it's been defined, applies all the transformations, and pulls it in. So now if I save this file again, let's see what the file size is. I expect it to grow slightly. Now my table was really small, so maybe you wouldn't notice that much of a difference. But let's go back and save it. And if you go back here, yep, it grew slightly from 3176 to 3766, I think, to 3943. Right, so any data you pull in, a copy of it is made here. Now let's go back and check out a few things in our query. Well, actually, hold on. So let me show you that here, indeed, we have the new table. Budget table is right here, and I can examine it, look at it, and it also shows up in the relationship view. Let's go back and into our queries pane, and let's talk about a few more things. So I'm inherently a very lazy person, and I have come to believe that's actually an attribute. That's a good quality. Because what I've realized is that I try to find the most efficient way of doing things because of my laziness. So one of the things where my laziness manifests itself is documentation. I hate documentation, and I think the whole thing is just pointless. I mean, it takes probably more effort to document the work that I do, and you can never keep it up to date. So I can spend an hour building the model, 4 hours trying to document it, and then the next time I make a change, I spend 15 more minutes changing things in my model. The documentation is out of date. So I have tried anything and everything to look for things that are self-documenting. Fortunately, in the query engine, it's very easy. You can also do a lot of things on the data model side, the measures and all that stuff. We'll talk about that. But for now, I love the query engine because, for one, it's inherently self-documenting, right? So if I am to open this file a month later, or if I'm not there and somebody else is handling it in my place, they open it, or if I win a lottery and leave my job and somebody else inherits it, all they have to do is take a look at the steps. And again, a lot of times I go back to a model that I built a month ago. I have no idea what I did, right? But it's self-documenting. All of those steps are there, and you can just step through them one by one, see what's happening. And again, I like having the formula bar because not only can I see, I can just glance at the formula and see what's going on. So I can look at the change type, and then I can see, yep, month is type date, budget amount is currency, product key is integer. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Unpivot columns. So a lot of these, I can just read through the formula. I don't even have to understand the language, the M language itself. You can kind of make sense of it. But hey, there is more. So this is cool. And of course, if something is broken, often you can, delete a step or modify it. Click on the gear icon. It's pretty easy to fix, but you can do more. For instance, here where I'm saying filtered rows, and I have to glance at the formula to see what's going on. Instead, I can rename these steps. So let's see that in action. So I can go here, and I can right click and say rename, and I can just add something there. Remove total and subtotal, right? So I can be as descriptive as I want to be, or as you can be brief, up to you. And again, you can do the same for any step which you think needs additional explanation. And if you are diligent about it, then it makes it really easy to glance through this. And again, we're going to start out with simple queries, but believe me, you're going to end up with stuff which is pretty sophisticated, which is cool. You want to leverage that. You want to leverage that power of Power Query or the query engine Power BI Desktop, but renaming things and such keeps you honest and makes your life easier later on. Another thing you can do is you can right click on it and say properties, and it essentially inserts a comment for this step. And I can come over here and I can say anything you want, right? So something that describes the step. What is the need? Why am I doing it? Just any additional information. Let's remove total and subtotal so that we do not double count later. Perfect, right? So you can put in any description, and I'm going to show you where it shows up. So as you hover over it, notice that the text shows up. So I'm going to give you a quick glimpse of the code underneath it. Don't let that scare you. It's not scary. It's no big deal, actually. So you've already seen snippets of it in the formula bar, but I'll show you what the source looks like. So again, if you go back to the View tab, this is where you had turned on the formula bar. There's another button here, Advanced Editor. All right, Advanced Editor, if you click on it, you see the whole script, and you notice here that you have the filtered rows step, filtered rows, remove total and subtotal, and this is where our comment was added. So, no mystery. You lift up the hood. That's what it is. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But again, the whole thing I'm talking about is self-documenting, but it does need some discipline, right? So if you're writing complex queries, as you would end up doing, make sure as you're writing it, name your steps. And I'll show you a couple of other tricks you can use to document these. And I'll show you one other thing here, which is really, really cool. And again, this is a simplistic scenarios, but if you end up with a lot more queries, the next thing I'm going to show you is going to be a lifesaver. And that is the Query Dependencies View. Now, if you remember in your Power BI Desktop, there was this relationship view, which is kind of a graphical view of the tables. This is the graphical view of your queries. So right now, it's not going to look very interesting, but maybe I'll share a screenshot of a real production model that I have built, and there, it's my lifesaver. So right now, let's zoom in a bit. So you can see I'm connecting to the Access database, and I can see that I'm pulling a whole bunch of tables from that, and then I'm connecting to this and pulling this budget table. Again, this is a simple example, but in complex examples, this one is really, really handy to trace your way through as to how the model has been built. Again, the whole emphasis is on self-documentation, and that's why I love this tool. All right, perfect. So we're done. We're done with step 1, which is to connect to multiple data sources and bring all that data back into Power BI Desktop. So we're ready to move to the next step.